All right. So, how to talk to a Marxist? I've changed it again. How to
Wait,
talk to
I
a
no
Marxist?
no no no. Wait, if you're going to be talking about election fraud, it has to be. You
Nope,
can't.
it's not that F word, John. We can't use
It's
that.
it's about how the Russians stole the election. We have to
Yeah.
find out what we don't know if the
Yeah.
Russians
So
did
from
steal the
this
election.
point forward, we will be saying Marxist when we say
I'm going to
fraud.
use
Or
Russians.
okay,
I
Russians,
believe the
Russians.
Russians stole, unless you can prove to me by giving me the ballots.
Okay.
And I can run them through a machine, and it can show whether the Russians, where they came from Russia, where Russia had anything to do with them. They can show how many times they folded them, or how many times they weren't folded them, and what machines that they used in to run them off. Those pesky Russians.
So my I want to point out where I got a lot of my information for this segment comes from Phil Klein and the Epic Times, who I have to point out, brother. Somebody said to me recently that the Epic Times is a run by a religious cult, meaning the Falun Gong, who are working out of China. And I want to just remind the people who think that Falun Gong is a religious cult, quote unquote cult, trying to demean it. And the reason why it's been called that is because the New York Times has labeled it that, so that's where their standing is. But remember, John, the reason
Ah,
why the New York Times is labeled that is because the Chi Coms have labeled it that as well. So the Chi Coms are the ones who are really calling it a religious cult, which of course they would, because there's 70 some million people in China, plus probably close to 100 million at this point, who are firmly in this camp. And there's a whole bunch of other religious groups of people, Christians and Muslims. All these groups are being terrorized because the bottom line of Marxism is, of course, the elimination of all competitors to the state and religion. God, Jesus Christ, even Allah, and Muhammad are competition to the state being the one, the final
so
authority
wait,
on
wait. You mean the Russian New York Times?
the
Because
Russian New York Times.
obviously, because they were
I would
so
just call them Chicoms because they're the real ones. Really,
I mean, the
I mean,
Russians. I
just
mean,
like the
they
just like
covered
when the
up
Nazis were
Stalin,
paying them off before World War II to cover up the Holocaust, John.
right? And right,
They're
and
all
they
being
did.
paid off now.
They
The
were
media is
pro. They
being
were
paid off now.
pro-Nazi.
They you know what, you back then they were, they who knows
They are.
about now.
Who says that things have changed?
Who
Why is
says? Who
anybody
says?
listening to those creeps? But that's a great point.
Okay,
Anytime anybody says anything to you about like them being a cult, say, "Oh, you're getting that from the," just like they try and
yeah,
say Fox and
biased
stuff.
media. Yeah,
They say, "Oh, you're getting that from the crap Russian, the Russian outlet, the Russian news, which is New York
yep.
Times."
And the rest of them too. It's not just the New York Times. It'd be one thing if we just had one Russian news network in this country. We got a whole bunch, brother. Got a whole bunch of those Chicoms running around. All right, so let's talk about, what do you say to somebody when they say, "Show me the proof. Show me the evidence. Show me the evidence." So $419 million. How about that to start off with some evidence? 419 million pieces of evidence. That is what Zuckerberg donated to a 503c to put his thumb on the scale of the election, his personal thumb, John, on the scale of the election. So he did that by a couple means, and I'll be using my notes here. He put this. He went to these states or these cities in the urban core of the country, meaning the Madison, Wisconsin. We're talking about Detroit, Michigan. We're talking about the swing
Atlanta.
states, Philadelphia, Atlanta. We're talking at Pittsburgh. These swing states that have the urban cores. He has this 503c, which we'll get to in a minute. Go into them and say, "We're going to give you millions of dollars. Millions of dollars is coming our way. But in order for us to give it to you, you have to change your rules a little bit. Now you got to change your rules by doing certain things, and I want to dive into them. I want to actually I'll start with, I wasn't going to start with yours first, but brother, in Delaware County, your county, right? In Delaware County, what they would do is they go into, and pretty much all of the urban core in Pennsylvania, they said, "We're going to give you this money, but you have to change the name of what you call polling stations, and you have to call them satellite offices." And because they're called satellite offices, John, and according to the law, they don't. Only polling places need to have a pair of Republicans and a pair of Democrats to adjudicate the different ballots. Now, so what do I mean when I say adjudicate? Again, I get into the weeds here, but very briefly, when there's a ballot that's got all messed up, that's crinkled, and is not running through a machine, they two Republicans, two Democrats sit down. This is a nationwide thing. They sit down and they look at the ballot and they say, "Oh, clearly this person voted for this candidate or that candidate." Then they refill out the ballot, a clean blank ballot, in the front of all four of them. They refill it out and they run that through the machine. That's the adjudicating process on it. So what they were doing in these satellite offices, because they're called satellite offices, they no longer need to have Republicans there. And that's why they can do all kinds of things like cover up the windows so you can't see into it. They can deny Republicans access to it because they're not polling stations. They're satellite offices that do the same thing, but by law don't have to have the same kind of adjudication process inside. So the counting was going on in there, unmonitored from the Republicans who were kicked out of the office. That went along the whole thing. But I want to get in mind that they went and tailored each of these different areas, like each of these different core urban areas. They went to them and they found what would work best in order to bring out the Biden vote. So the entire purpose of this $419 plus million that we know of so far was to pull out the Democratic vote, to enhance the Democratic vote, to drive the Democratic vote to the polls, and not anywhere else, which in itself creates a question of equality and unequal access, very similar to what you would see in the South. Again, the Democrats are taking these Marxists are taking notes from the past in their Democrat ancestors in the South, because in the polling stations, after Black people got the right to vote, they would have unequal treatment in different areas where they would have poll taxes or questionnaires before you could take to see test your level of intelligence before you could take take the ballot and vote in it. So they would do that purposely. So they did that to change the nature of the drawing in a crowd of voters. And then they put in like these boxes, the mail-in voting. They would have this mail-in voting. Then they would have boxes. Of course, we had that in New Jersey. And what you would see is in some place like your county, John, Delaware County, they would have enough. This 503C would pay for these boxes, and they would put so many more available that in every square 2 miles, you would have. I'm sorry, every square 4 miles, you would have a box. All right, and in a pro-Trump area, the boxes would be 1,159 square miles. So 4 square miles versus just call it 1,200 square miles in distance. So you would find a box every 1,200 square miles in the 50 some other counties that voted for President Trump, whereas in Philadelphia, it's and Delaware County,
66, 65, 67 total.
Yeah, 50 every 2 square miles, 4 square miles, you'd find a box. So that's just some of the ways. And then like Michigan, I'll give you the other example. Michigan would have part of the money that was done there is they would have consolidated all the counting areas to one big ice arena in Michigan, and they would have 100 some tables. People would be counting it, and in that kind of situation, Republicans would have access to the entire floor. They should have had access to see what was going on, to be able to see it, but instead, the Republicans were dumped up into the cheap seats all the way at the very top, the furthest distance that they could from the balloting, so that, of course, if there was anything illegal going on, that they would know about it. And so they had donated like a $400 million to the Center for Tech and Civic Life, which is the 503C that Zuckerberg was paying for, and also for the Center for Election Innovation and Research got about $50 million as well. So this the purpose of all this, of course, was to put their fingers on the scale, but this couldn't have been done really to any effectiveness without, of course, what was happening in March and April of last year. And if you remember, brother, there was a lot of court cases going for. So I want to point out that the problem with the Zuckerberg giving the money is it does create unequal treatment. But when a Democrat says, "So what? It's his money," the answer to that is okay. Next election, President Trump decides to put $1 billion, because he is a billionaire, decides to do the same thing but with $1 billion, and so he drives the Republican vote in those counties that voted for him, and then he purposely goes into these core urban centers and he he could shut down the vote for the Democrats. Why not? Why can't he do that? If Zuckerberg can do the opposite, why can't any Republican, any candidate do the same thing? That's what you got to think about. This is not about, and the president has made this case repeatedly. This isn't about, yes, he would want to have been reelected, but this is also about the safety and the Russians not having fraud within our election. Hint, hint. So, okay, before I get off, real briefly about the court cases. First of all, there's two different kinds of court cases I want to talk about. First, there hasn't been, and John, you can correct me on this, but there's been few, if any, court cases on the actual merits of the evidence based, because
no evidence.
All been dismissed on standing. And I point to this because I had plenty of evidence. I know this is how courts work because when it came to my daughter's situation, when she was held against her will in New York City by a certain medical institution, I had excellent evidence. I had even their documentation stating what they were doing wrong. And I had doctors who were backing me up, who were willing to go into court and say this. And yet the judge threw the case out because they said there wasn't standing for it. And so I understand completely what is going on here. So when some knucklehead says that it's not, there was no evidence, they threw it out because there wasn't evidence. No, they threw it out because it wasn't standing. Two different things, as I can attest to personally. So that's the one kind of court case. And the other kind of court case is the fact that a lot of these small 503Cs were pushing, and Democrat organizations were pushing for mail-in voting throughout the country, and especially in the swing states. And I have to say, even Governor Murphy, Knucklehead Murphy, who is probably the worst governor I've ever experienced in my
Witless Whitmer.
Well, I haven't experienced her. I've experienced Murphy, the guy who's responsible for up to 14,000 deaths in these homes. This guy who said the Constitution is above his pay grade, even he knew enough to get the legislature to vote on mail-in voting, to change the rules of the election. And yet all of these other states, all these other knucklehead governors, like Pennsylvania's, like Michigan's, like probably I think Wisconsin's too, and Georgia, they didn't get this legislature to change the rules. And of course, the Constitution says there's only one body that's allowed to change the rules when it comes to an election, in a federal election, and that body is, of course, the state's legislature. So when they say that there's no question of, I start with those two. By the way, if you haven't noticed, I haven't mentioned Dominion until this moment. I haven't mentioned any of those machines until this moment, which I could, but I'm running out of time and I'm not going to. We'll do that, save that for another show. But I want to point out that I didn't mention it once. So when they try to say that it's some kind of conspiracy theory, explain that to ask them to explain it to you, because every bit of information I give you is public record. Every bit of information I provide to you is out there for anybody who has the intellectual curiosity. And if they want to swallow the pablum of the Democrats, go ahead. It's not going to be a good taste. So, brother,